February 7th, 1945. Waldkirch Freight Rail Station, Baden, Germany. The metal made no sound as it closed on skin. It simply pressed, slowly, without pause, as if pain had all the time it needed to do its job, as if there were no urgency at all, as if suffering were just another bureaucratic formality. One more line added to a document signed by someone who hadn't bothered to read it. 5 Jewish women stood in a line against a wall of damp bricks in the station's unloading yard, their backs pressed to the icy surface, their feet bare because their shoes had been lost days earlier, maybe weeks, sinking into the frozen mud that covered the uneven ground. They didn't scream or ask for anything. The Bavarian winter in February had already done that work for the guards. The chains had been biting into their wrists for about 48 hours, maybe more. No one knew for sure, because time stopped making sense once hunger and cold became constant. Hannah Weiss kept her back straight out of habit, not strength. She was 34, from Brno in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and before the war she had worked as an accountant at a textile company, used to numbers, ledgers, and columns that had to balance at the end of the day. Now every breath required a different kind of calculation. Each inhale was a negotiation with the freezing air that entered her lungs like blades, and every movement a silent agreement with a body that no longer fully obeyed. Her ribs showed through the worn fabric, her fingers, swollen from the cold, barely closed, but her back remained straight because somewhere deep in her mind, Hannah knew that the day she hunched over would be the day she accepted what they were trying to do to her, turn her into something less than human. Beside her stood Miriam Adler, 15 years old, too young for that winter and too fragile for that world, trembling without a sound. The shaking wasn't new. It had started 3 days after she arrived at the camp and no longer stopped. Not even in sleep. Her body had learned that drawing attention was dangerous, that noise invited punishment, and that existing quietly was the only way to stay alive. She was from Sosnowiec, Poland. Before the war, she went to school, studied literature, and wanted to be a teacher. Now she couldn't remember the last time she held a book, or the last time someone spoke her name with affection. Eva Kornfeld, 42, from Przemyśl, stared at the ground with an intensity that might have looked like resignation, though it wasn't. It was calculation. She had been a nurse before the war and worked in a hospital during the typhus epidemic of 1935, where she watched 300 people die in 6 months, and she learned that looking at death for too long was an invitation. She knew that meeting a soldier's eyes was an offering, and that lifting her gaze was the same as asking for attention. And in that place, attention always ended badly. The other 2 women, whose names had been lost in the official records, but whom Hannah remembered as Ruth Stein and Deborah Fuchs, stood with their eyes closed. One of them murmured something in Yiddish, maybe a prayer, maybe just fragments of words, and no one asked. The loading yard was a rectangle of trampled earth, surrounded by 3 wooden barracks and the station building. About 50 meters away, the tracks glinted under the gray light of dawn. A convoy had arrived the night before, and no one knew what it carried, nor did anyone feel curious enough to find out. Trains came and went. Some brought prisoners, others carried away corpses, and by February 1945, that distinction was becoming harder and harder to see. Then the boots stopped in front of them. Worn leather, soles caked with mud, uneven laces tied in haste. They weren't an officer's boots, but those of a rank-and-file soldier. Boots that had walked too far, carried too much, and survived more than they ever should have. There were no shouts, no clear orders. Just a German soldier who crouched down slowly, moving carefully as if his knees were protesting, pulled a tool from the pocket of his coat, a pair of wire cutters with rusted edges, and set it against the first chain. The snap was sharp and final, like a gunshot without powder, or the clean crack of a bone breaking. Miriam felt the iron spring open millimeters from her skin, and the thought arrived without asking permission. They're marking me. Then another. This is a new punishment. And then the third, unavoidable one. This is the end. She had heard stories of prisoners being marked just before execution. She had seen guards cut into wrists to single out those who tried to escape. She assumed this was the same thing, just a more precise, more permanent cruelty, until the pressure stopped. The chain fell to the ground with a dull thud, raising a small cloud of dust that hovered for a moment in the frozen air before disappearing. One after another. Click. The second chain. Click. The third. Click. The fourth. Click. The fifth. Hannah lifted her head for the first time in 2 days and saw that the soldier wasn't looking at any of them. His eyes were fixed on his own hands, as if he were watching someone else do the work, as if he wanted to forget every gesture, as if each movement were a quiet betrayal of himself. The lines around his mouth didn't match his filthy uniform, and his hands shook as he held the tool. Not fear, but something deeper, something unnamed in that place. Then he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. He didn't say who he was. He offered no reasons and asked for no forgiveness. He simply said, in German, in a tone that didn't belong there, a domestic tone, almost a table-after-dinner voice, a tone of misplaced humanity. They are not animals. 3 words. He slipped the tool back into his pocket with the same care he'd used to take it out, straightened up by leaning first on one knee and then the other, like someone carrying more weight than he could hold, and walked toward the guard barracks without looking back. His hands were still trembling inside worn gloves, his shoulders slightly slumped, as if he had just set something unbearably heavy down on the ground. In that silence, all of them understood that something had changed. They didn't know what, or why, or how long it would last. But the air had shifted, like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for years, like an invisible wall made of orders and fear cracking for a single instant. Because in February 1945, with Germany collapsing inward like a building without foundations, with the Soviets 300 kilometers from Berlin and the Americans crossing the Rhine after breaking the Siegfried Line, with cities burning under nightly bombings and western stations clogged with refugee trains, that soldier had just broken the only rule holding the system together: enforced dehumanization. And by breaking it, even for a moment, even if no one else saw and nothing changed in the larger machinery of the war, he proved that choice still existed. By February 1945, Germany was no longer the country imagined 12 years earlier, when red flags with black swastikas hung from every building and crowds shouted slogans in unison. Now it existed as a ruin in motion, like an organism that keeps functioning after the brain has died. Cities burned under Allied bombing that arrived every night with clockwork precision. Dresden had been erased from the map 2 days earlier, on February 13th, in a firestorm that killed 25,000 people in a single night. Berlin was a field of rubble where people survived in flooded basements. Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt were ghost cities, standing facades with nothing behind them. The military trains that once carried entire divisions eastward in wagons painted with victorious slogans were now hauling wounded soldiers to hospitals without morphine, without bandages, and without enough doctors. Those who arrived with amputated limbs were, paradoxically, the lucky ones. Those who came in with internal injuries usually died in the corridors, waiting for a bed that never opened up. Meanwhile, the forced labor camps, scattered across Bavaria and Austria like an invisible web of administrative suffering, took in more prisoners every day, evacuees from the east, where the Red Army advanced without pause, liberating places like Auschwitz, evacuated on January 27th and left behind with the dying and empty gas chambers, driving tens of thousands of people into forced marches westward that killed half of those who began them. Marches with no real destination. Marches designed only to erase evidence, to make sure the Allies would find no witnesses and history would be left without voices capable of telling what had happened. Waldlager Süd was one of those places the Reich preferred not to name. It appeared in no official speeches or newsreels, carried no epic weight, no heroic purpose. It was merely a sub-camp of the Dachau system, one of roughly 160 spread across Bavaria like bureaucratic metastases. It didn't show up on formal maps. It had no famous commanders, just rotting wooden barracks thrown together in 2 weeks, rusted wire fences that sagged in the wind, and a loading yard where trains arrived filled with nameless people, reduced to numbers stitched onto frayed cloth, bodies meant to work until they stopped working. The system held because no one questioned anything. Because questioning was treason. Because seeing prisoners as people was considered a moral failure under official doctrine, a bourgeois weakness, a Jewish contamination of Aryan thought, a betrayal of the 1,000-year Reich being built on anonymous corpses. The orders were simple and repeated endlessly. Maximum productivity, minimal compassion, zero unnecessary eye contact. Guards who showed mercy were sent to punishment units, or to something worse. No one asked what that worse meant, because no one wanted to know. And yet, in that final winter, when everything was starting to come apart and the rules were losing meaning because the Reich itself was dying, a rank-and-file soldier named Karl Neumann broke that rule without raising his voice, without speeches or letters or any expectation of recognition. He simply acted. Karl was 39, too old for the front lines where 18-year-old boys were dying, too old to believe in impossible victories promised by officers who had never set foot on a battlefield. He had been born in 1906 in a small town near Heidelberg, in a 2-story house with a carpenter's workshop on the ground floor and 3 rooms upstairs. He was the son of Otto Neumann, a carpenter, and Elise Neumann, a schoolteacher, the eldest of 3 brothers, the one meant to inherit the workshop, the one who learned to read the grain of wood before he learned to read books. His childhood was ordinary for interwar Germany. Modest poverty, enough food but never abundance, school until 14 and then a full apprenticeship in his father's shop. By 18, he could build a chair without instructions. By 20, he could repair almost any piece of farm machinery. By 25, he had specialized in tractor engines, a valuable skill in a region where horses were beginning to disappear. Karl was not a man of big words, or poetry, or philosophy. He didn't attend political rallies. He was a man of precise hands and long silences, capable of spending hours fixing an engine without speaking and still always finding the right part at exactly the right moment. The kind of person the village turned to when something broke, and they needed it fixed, without being overcharged. He had enlisted in 1939 not out of nationalist fervor, but because everyone did, because not doing so was worse, because men who refused received visits from the Gestapo with uncomfortable questions about loyalty to the Reich and commitment to the cause, and because his younger brother was already serving in an infantry unit in Poland, while his mother cried every nights, thinking that both of them would die. During the first years of the war, The years of quick victories, when France fell in 6 weeks and Poland in 1, when it seemed the Reich really might last 1,000 years. Karl served in logistics units in France and Poland. He never fired a weapon in combat. He never witnessed heroic battles or charged anyone with a bayonet. What he saw instead were trucks loaded with supplies heading toward the front, trains packed with exhausted soldiers returning with empty eyes, and orders printed on yellowing paper, signed by officers whose names changed every month because the previous ones had been killed or removed for incompetence. His job was to keep vehicles running, repair engines, change tires, make sure convoys departed on time. Essential work and invisible. No articles were written about it, no medals awarded. Just constant transfers following the movement of the front, always about 50 kilometers from the real fighting. In 1943, something broke. During a routine inspection at a supply depot on the outskirts of Warsaw, Karl came across a Polish civilian, an older man, around 60, gray-bearded, wearing worn clothes, being beaten by 2 SS soldiers in an alley behind the warehouse. The man lay on the ground as black boots came down again and again. He didn't fight back. He only curled inward, hands over his head, trying to shield himself from blows delivered with mechanical precision. Karl stopped about 20 meters away. At first they didn't notice him, focused on their task. One soldier shouted insults in German. The other kicked in silence, expressionless, like someone chopping wood or carrying out a tedious duty. Karl knew he should keep walking. It wasn't his business. Intervening would only bring trouble. But something nameless, deeper than fear or calculation, kept him frozen in place. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The man on the ground stopped moving. Then Karl spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't approach. From where he stood, in a steady voice without aggression, he said, "That's enough." The soldiers stopped and looked at him. The one who had been shouting had a face flushed with effort. The other remained blank. "Do you have a problem, soldier?" the first one asked. Karl didn't answer right away. He looked at the man on the ground, then at them, and said that he wasn't moving anymore, that he had stolen a sack of potatoes from the warehouse, and repeated, "He's not moving." The silence was uncomfortable. The 2 soldiers glanced at each other. The one who hadn't spoken shrugged. "Suit yourself." They walked back toward the main street. Karl approached, wiped his hands on his trousers, and saw that the man was still alive. Breathing with difficulty, one eye swollen shut, blood in his mouth. He helped him sit up. Neither of them said anything. They exchanged a brief look, and Karl continued on toward the depot, convinced it was over. 2 days later, he was summoned to his superior's office. A captain with a Prussian surname and bureaucratic manners informed him that he had been reported for interfering in an authorized disciplinary procedure against an enemy civilian and asked whether he had anything to say in his defense. Karl replied that it hadn't been necessary to keep beating him. The captain studied him for a long moment and said that it wasn't Karl's decision to make. Karl was demoted from corporal to private. He was transferred out of Poland and sent back to Germany, assigned to Waldlager Süd, a place where soldiers with no future guarded prisoners with no names. From then on, he carried that sentence in silence, not as heroism, but as weight, as an invisible mark that set him apart from the others and reminded him that he had chosen to see when almost everyone else looked away. The Waldlager Süd subcamp was not an immediate extermination center like Auschwitz or Treblinka. There were no gas chambers, no crematoria running without pause, no ramps where doctors decided with a gesture who would live and who would die. It was something else, slower, grayer, deeply bureaucratic. Death came there through attrition, without haste or spectacle, almost without witnesses. The prisoners, mostly Hungarian, Polish, and Czech Jews, evacuated from the eastern camps, worked 12 hours a day digging underground tunnels for an armaments factory that never went into operation. The original plan had been to build facilities underground, safe from Allied bombing. But by February 1945, with the Reich collapsing, the project no longer made sense. Still, the tunnels kept advancing because no one gave the order to stop, because the system kept running by pure inertia, because keeping people working until they died was easier than deciding what to do with them. They were given about 200 grams of black bread a day, sometimes less, sometimes nothing. They slept in unheated barracks, where 50 people shared 30 wooden bunks without mattresses. They drank water from a contaminated well that caused chronic dysentery and died slowly, without drama and without an audience, inside a mechanism designed to make death a formality, a line erased from a ledger, a number that ceased to exist. Hannah Weiss arrived in December 1944 after passing through 3 different camps. First, Theresienstadt, where she endured 8 months in a ghetto-turned-transit camp. Then Auschwitz, where she spent 3 weeks before being selected for evacuation. And finally, a 6-day forced march from a subcamp in Austria that killed half the group. 200 people began the march. 97 reached Waldlager Süd. The rest were left in ditches, forests, and snow-covered fields, nameless, unburied, unrecorded. When Hannah arrived, she weighed 42 kilos. Before the war, she had weighed 68. She no longer expected rescue or justice or explanations, only to endure until tomorrow, and if tomorrow came, to endure until the day after. One day at a time, one breath at a time, holding on to the constant decision not to surrender. Miriam Adler arrived with her from Sosnowiec, Poland, 15 years old and without a mother. She had lost her during the march, when she sat down to rest in the snow and never stood up again. Her father had died months earlier, shot in a mass grave near Krakow, along with 300 other men. Miriam had watched him being taken away and had heard the gunshots in the distance, understanding without being told that he would not return. She no longer cried. Crying belonged to another life. Now she simply walked, obeyed, and existed in the smallest space possible, trying not to be seen, not to stand out, because standing out meant dying sooner. Eva Kornfeld arrived in January from Przemyśl at 42 years old. Before the war, she had been a nurse at a municipal hospital. She had faced epidemics, assisted in difficult births, and closed the eyes of terminal patients with the calm of someone who knows death is not an enemy, but an ending. Here she was prisoner number 84719, a number stitched onto frayed cloth, a number that appeared on lists, ate, worked, slept, and would one day cease to exist without anyone asking why. Eva learned to move slowly, to draw no attention, to exist like a shadow, to pass unnoticed in formations, to take her bowl of soup without looking at the guard, to sleep with one eye open, wake without sound, and move through the camp as if she were not there. Because being there, being seen, being noticed, being remembered, was dangerous. Dangerous! The 3 of them shared the same barracks, number 7, a wooden structure with a slanted roof and walls that let the wind pass through as if they weren't there at all. They slept on bunks without mattresses, just bare planks covered with thin blankets that smelled of mold and sweat, and they shared the same fear and the same strategy for staying alive. Remain unnoticed, Don't stand out. Don't talk too much. Don't look for too long. Exist on the edge of visibility, that place where death sometimes looks past you because it doesn't quite see you. But on February 5th, 1945, something went wrong during morning roll call, the daily ritual in the central yard, while guards counted heads and checked that no one had died during the night. Miriam stumbled. It wasn't her fault. The ground was frozen. A sheet of ice covered the mud, and her bare feet slipped. She fell forward, her hands hitting the ground with a dull crack, right in front of an SS guard, a young man, maybe 25, with an empty face and eyes without a trace of emotion. The kind who followed orders without thinking, without hatred, and without pleasure. When Miriam tried to get up, the guard kicked her once in the ribs, the blow knocking her back to the ground. She didn't scream. She had learned not to, even as her body curled inward on reflex. The guard lifted his boot again, and then Hannah moved. It wasn't a calculated decision. It was pure instinct. She stepped out of the line, just 2 steps, only 2, enough to place herself between the guard and Miriam. She didn't say anything. She didn't raise her hands. She simply occupied the space and allowed herself to be seen. The guard stopped. He looked at Hannah, then at Miriam, then at the motionless line of prisoners. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He pointed with his finger toward the loading yard. Hannah understood. Miriam understood. And Ava, 3 places back, understood too. They had been marked. After roll call, they were escorted to the loading yard without explanations, without trial or paperwork. Just a silent order carried out with bureaucratic precision. They were chained to a fixed iron bar along the wall, wrists caught in rusted chains. No food, no water, no words. A public warning to the others. This is what happens when you step out of line, when you break invisibility, when you decide to be seen. 48 hours later, they were still there. The cold had settled into their bones. Hunger gnawed from the inside like an animal. Thirst was worse. Dry mouths, swollen tongues, cracked lips that bled when they tried to wet them. That was when Carl saw them. It wasn't the first time he had seen prisoners in chains, and it wasn't the first time he felt something was wrong, but it was the first time he stopped, looked straight ahead, and let his mind register what his eyes were seeing. It was mid-afternoon on February 7th, a gray day, no sun, no wind, just a steady cold that made the lungs ache. Carl had finished his shift at the supply depot, a concrete building filled with tools, spare parts, and rations, and was heading back to the guards' barracks when he heard the sound of metal against skin, dry, repetitive, like a clock marking each second of pain. He turned toward the loading yard and saw them. 5 women, motionless, chained, 2 with their eyes closed, retreating somewhere inside where the pain couldn't reach. One shaking uncontrollably, racked by spasms she couldn't stop. Another staring at the ground with the concentration of someone who had decided the ground was the only safe place. And Hannah was looking at him, not with pleading, not with hope, not even with hatred, but with something worse, recognition. As if she knew exactly who he was, what he represented, and what system he served. As if she had already accepted that no one would do anything. As if she had seen this scene too many times, and Carl was just another cog in a machine built to grind people down and turn them into numbers. Carl stood there, motionless, for about 30 seconds, maybe less, maybe more. Time stopped mattering because the only thing that was real was the decision beginning to take shape inside him. A decision without words or logic, without any plan at all, born in a place deeper than fear or reason. He looked around and confirmed that no other guards were nearby. The yard was empty except for the 5 chained women. Lieutenant Armin Vogel, his immediate superior, a 31-year-old man with almost terrifying bureaucratic precision and the absolute conviction that following rules was the same as doing what was right, was in the administrative office reviewing reports. The other soldiers were in the mess hall or the barracks. It was a shift change, that interval when no one watches because everyone assumes someone else is. Carl reached into his pocket and pulled out a tool, a pair of wire cutters he used to repair fencing when the wind damaged it. It wasn't a planned act or a carefully reasoned moral decision. He didn't calculate consequences or tell himself, "I'm going to do this." It was something his body decided while his mind watched from a distance. He crouched in front of Miriam. His knees creaked. His hands trembled slightly. The girl looked at him with wide eyes, eyes that had seen too much and no longer expected kindness. She didn't understand what was happening. She thought they were marking her, that this was the end, that this German soldier with a dirty uniform and a tired face would be the last thing she would ever see. But Carl set the tool against the chain and squeezed. The metal gave way with a sharp snap, like a small bone breaking, like a promise being kept. He moved to the next woman, and then the next, without looking any of them in the eyes, keeping his gaze fixed on the metal, on the chains, on the mechanical gesture of the work. 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 chains, 5 women, 5 wrists freed, still bearing red marks where the iron had bitten into the skin for 2 days. None of them spoke or moved. Not out of fear, but because they didn't know what to do. They didn't understand what had just happened. They only felt the weight vanish from their wrists, the air entering their lungs with less effort, something impossible to name shifting in that moment. Carl put the tool away and stood up with difficulty, legs stiff, hands still shaking. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself, without looking at any of them. "They are not animals." 3 words in German. Nothing more. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't explain his reasons. He didn't ask for forgiveness or promise anything. He said those words and walked toward the guards' barracks, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly slumped, like someone who has just set down a burden too heavy to carry and is trying to remember how to walk without it. In the silence that followed, the 5 women understood that they had witnessed something that should not exist there, something that violated every rule of the camp and made no sense within its logic. Spontaneous compassion. An act without witnesses or benefit, without calculation or reward. A German soldier who chose to see people where the system demanded numbers. Hannah slowly rubbed her wrists, the skin red and swollen but free, and stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if they still belonged to someone who had the right to move her fingers without permission. Miriam sat down on the ground, not because her legs failed her, but because she needed to touch something solid and real, something that would confirm that this was not a dream. Eva looked toward the spot where Carl had disappeared. She said nothing, but she stored that moment deep in her memory, in the place where important things are kept, when you know you might not survive to tell them. About 3 hours passed before anyone noticed the broken chains. It was a young guard, newly arrived from Munich, during the evening round in the loading yard. It was only his 2nd week at Waldlager Süd. He didn't yet fully understand how the system worked. He still asked questions. He still expected orders to make sense. He saw the 5 women standing free by the wall, the broken chains on the ground, and he didn't understand what had happened or whether it was a mistake. He hesitated about whether to report it, but decided to do so because that was how he had been trained. Because reporting irregularities was the right thing according to the manual. The report reached Lieutenant Armin Vogel in less than 15 minutes. Vogel was not cruel by nature, nor did he take pleasure in the suffering of others. He didn't feel satisfaction when prisoners died. He wasn't a sadist. He was something more dangerous, a man efficient by conviction, an absolute believer in the system and its rules, convinced that any deviation was a direct threat to order. He could sign an execution without hatred or emotion, with the calm of someone following procedure. He didn't need to hate prisoners to reduce them to numbers. He only needed to believe it was right, necessary, part of something larger that must not be questioned. Because questioning it would mean dismantling the structure that gave his life meaning. When he read the report, his initial reaction was irritation. Not fury, not moral outrage, but a discomfort like discovering that someone had moved something on his desk, that a form had been filled out incorrectly, or that the coffee was cold. Someone had altered a disciplinary protocol without authorization. That was intolerable, not because of the act itself, but because it was an irregularity, and irregularities, if not corrected, led to chaos. He summoned all the guards on the afternoon shift to the administrative office, 12 men in total. Karl was among them, standing in the third row, hands at his sides, wearing his usual neutral expression. Vogel went straight to the point, without preamble. Someone had released 5 prisoners who were being disciplined for violating formation rules. He wasn't interested in moral speeches or complicated explanations. He simply wanted to know who had done it. Silence. The 12 men stared straight ahead. No one spoke or moved. The wall clock marked the seconds with an unnaturally loud tick. Vogel waited 30 seconds and asked again, this time walking in front of the line, fixing his gaze on each face with the precision of someone who knows how to detect lies. When he reached Karl, he stopped. Something in Karl's posture, in the way he held Vogel's gaze without defiance but without fear, felt familiar. It was something he had seen before in men who had already decided and were not going to step back. Was it you? Karl didn't look away. He didn't tremble. He didn't lie or justify himself. He simply answered in a clear, low voice. It was me. Vogel watched him in silence for 5 seconds, and then nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion. Karl offered no arguments, no moral manifestos, no speeches about human dignity, only what he had felt when he saw those 5 women in chains, and knew it wasn't necessary. Vogel closed the file he was holding, and without raising his voice or making threats, in the flat tone of someone reading a recipe, ordered him to chain them back up with the same chains in the same place and leave them there for another 48 hours. Karl didn't respond. He didn't move. Vogel waited another 5 seconds and added, in the same bureaucratic voice, that it was a direct order, and that if he didn't carry it out within the next 10 minutes, he would be transferred to a punishment platoon on the Eastern Front, where life expectancy was around 3 weeks, and the 5 prisoners would be executed for attempted escape. That was when Karl understood that there was no way out within the system, at least not for him, and perhaps not for them either. The system left no room for compassion. It recognized only obedience or punishment. But there was something else, a third option it never accounted for, because it assumed everyone would choose either compliance or open rebellion. Karl could choose silent resistance. That night, he did not chain anyone back up. Not because he staged a public act of defiance or confronted Vogel face to face, but because he simply didn't do it. He let the 10 minutes pass. He let an hour pass. He let the 10 o'clock shift change come and go. And instead of returning to the yard, he walked to barracks number 7, where Hannah, Miriam, and Ava were housed. He didn't enter. He didn't draw attention. He just left a small bundle by the door, wrapped in gray cloth. Inside were 3 pieces of black bread, small, about 50 grams each, taken from his own ration. A canteen with half a liter of water, also his, and a folded slip of paper with a single word written in German, the handwriting uneven, as if the hand had trembled while writing it. Durchhalten. No signature, no explanation. No way to trace it back to him. Hannah found it at dawn, when she went out to empty the waste bucket. She hid the bundle under her clothes, carried it inside, and shared it with Miriam and Ava. They ate slowly, tasting every crumb. They drank the water in small sips, and when Hannah unfolded the paper and read the word, she understood the message. Someone, in the middle of hell, still saw them as people. Someone inside the system designed to dehumanize had chosen to resist, and if he could do it, so could they. The days that followed were strange. Vogel never mentioned the chains again. He didn't punish Karl. He didn't transfer him. He didn't order the execution of the 5 women. It was as if the episode had been erased from the official record, as if it had never happened, though something had shifted in the air of the camp, something invisible but real. Karl then began doing small things, almost imperceptible things, but things that mattered deeply to those who received them. During morning roll calls, when a prisoner stumbled or arrived late, he would look the other way and give a few extra seconds before the count. In the mess hall, during ration distribution, he would let extra pieces of bread fall into certain bowls. Not all of them. Only those of people who seemed closest to the edge. During night inspections, he walked the barracks more slowly, knocked softly before entering, and gave time to adjust, to hide what was forbidden, to stop crying in a low voice. It wasn't heroism. It was silent resistance. The daily decision not to fully participate in the system and to preserve a space, however small, where humanity could still exist. And Karl wasn't alone. Other soldiers, few, maybe 3 or 4 out of the camp's 20, began doing the same, without discussing it or coordinating, as if someone had broken an invisible barrier that had prevented them from being human and given them permission to remember who they had been before the war. Hannah was the first to notice. Hannah saw how Karl looked away when someone fell. She also saw another guard, an older man with a Bavarian accent, leave doors ajar on the coldest nights, so the heat from the wood stoves in the administrative barracks could drift toward the prisoners. Eva noticed it too. The soup had a bit more substance. The night counts were faster and less invasive. Miriam, in her silence, began to walk just a little more upright. Not enough to draw attention, but enough for Hannah and Eva to sense that something in her posture had shifted, as if an invisible weight had lightened slightly. The camp was still hell. People kept dying. Hunger killed slowly, and the cold remained unbearable. But small pockets of humanity appeared. Brief, fragile moments where the system cracked and something else was allowed to exist. And then, on April 28, 1945, it ended. At 9:17 in the morning, the first Sherman tanks of the United States Army reached the outskirts of Waldlager Süd. There was no epic battle, no heroic last stand. The SS guards and senior officers, the ones with blood directly on their hands, the ones whose names appeared in records, had fled the night before, burning documents, destroying files, loading trucks, and heading south toward Austria, hoping to hide in the mountains and reinvent themselves when the war was over. What remained were enlisted men like Karl, skeletal prisoners barely able to walk, empty barracks, broken barbed wire, and a heavy silence. When the tanks entered the camp, the remaining German soldiers were arrested immediately. There were no negotiations, no distinctions between active perpetrators and those who had simply been there. All were considered complicit, handcuffed, and loaded onto military trucks. Karl did not try to escape. He didn't run for the forest or take off his uniform. He waited, seated in the loading yard, the same place where he had cut 5 chains, with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the ground. An American captain named James Morrison from Ohio, with the face of a man who had seen too much too quickly, approached him and asked his name in basic German. Karl answered, "Karl Neumann, private." He denied having taken part in executions or torture. Morrison studied him for a moment. He saw a 39-year-old man who looked 50, tired eyes, hands trembling slightly, shoulders slumped, and asked if he had done anything for them, gesturing toward the prisoners being treated by army medics in the central yard. Karl looked toward Hannah, Miriam, and Ava, who were being examined by a doctor wearing a Red Cross armband, and after a pause said slowly, "I cut some chains." Morrison didn't fully understand, and he didn't press. There was no time for complicated stories. 3,000 prisoners needed urgent medical care. 100 bodies needed to be buried. Dozens of guards had to be processed. He registered Karl as a prisoner of war, loaded him onto a truck with 23 other German soldiers, and sent him to a provisional detention camp outside Munich. Karl spent 18 months there. He was not tried at Nuremberg. He was not formally charged with war crimes. He didn't appear in newspapers. He wasn't hanged or sentenced to prison. He simply waited, like so many enlisted men without blood directly on their hands, who had nonetheless been there, had seen, had participated by omission, part of a system that murdered 6 million Jews and 5 million other victims. The detention camp was a former barracks converted into a temporary prison, with 3,000 men crammed into a space built for 500, basic rations, occasional interrogations, and a constant, grinding boredom. And the question remained, one no one knew how to answer. What comes next? Karl spent those 18 months working in the camp workshop, fixing whatever broke, repairing engines, building furniture for administrative offices. He spoke little, made no friends, and avoided the late-night conversations in which other prisoners argued about guilt, mistakes, and the exact moment when everything had gone wrong. He simply worked and waited. He was released in October 1946 without ceremony. They handed him a document certifying that he had been processed and released without charges, 50 German marks, a second-hand civilian suit, and the instruction that he was free to go. Karl returned to Heidelberg, to the house where he had grown up, with the carpentry shop on the ground floor, and discovered that it no longer existed. An Allied bombing raid in March 1945 had destroyed the entire street. Only rubble and half-standing walls remained. His father, Otto, had died in that attack at 72, trapped in the basement while trying to protect the workshop tools as the building collapsed. His mother, Elise, was living with a sister in a village 20 kilometers away. Karl went to see her. She held him for 5 minutes without saying a word. Then she made coffee, and they talked about small things, the weather, the neighbors, when reconstruction might begin. They never mentioned the war. Karl found work as a carpenter in a furniture factory and spent the next 22 years there, clocking in at 7 in the morning and leaving at 5 in the afternoon, making chairs, tables, wardrobes, and beds, useful objects for a country rebuilding itself from ruins. In 1950, he married a woman named Hannah, a 32-year-old widow whose first husband had been killed at Stalingrad in 1943. They met in a church and married 3 months later in a small ceremony with 5 guests. They had 2 children, a boy in 1951 and a girl in 1953, and lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Heidelberg, with 3 rooms, a garden where Karl grew tomatoes, lettuce, and carrots, and a shed for his tools. It was an ordinary, quiet life. No drama, no stories to tell at gatherings. Karl never spoke about Waldlager Süd. He never mentioned the chains. He never wrote memoirs or sought recognition. His children didn't know he had been in a concentration camp until years later, when they found the release document in an old drawer while cleaning the attic. They asked him what he had done during the war. He answered, "My job," and said nothing more. He died in 1982 at 76 from a silent heart attack while repairing a kitchen table in the shed. His heart simply stopped. He collapsed onto the wood with the tool still in his hand. Hannah found him 20 minutes later. The funeral was small. Close family, a few neighbors, some co-workers, and no one mentioned Waldlager Süd because no one knew. Karl was buried in a municipal cemetery under a simple headstone that read, Karl Neumann, 1906-1982. Rest in peace. Hannah Weiss survived the liberation. When American doctors weighed her on April 28, 1945, they recorded 38 kilos. She spent 3 months in a provisional hospital run by the Red Cross outside Munich. During the first days, she couldn't eat solid food. Her digestive system had collapsed. She tolerated only very thin soup, taken in slow sips. Doctors said that if she had arrived a week later, she probably would have died. In August 1945, once she could walk without assistance, she emigrated to Palestine on a clandestine ship organized by Zionist groups. The journey lasted 2 weeks. 150 people crammed into a vessel designed for 50. But she arrived and settled in Tel Aviv, where she worked as a cleaner for 2 years while learning Hebrew. After that, she found work as an accountant at a textile company and discovered that numbers still made sense, that they still behaved predictably, that they still balanced the way they were supposed to. In 1950, she married a man named David, also a survivor and also from Czechoslovakia. They didn't talk much about the past. They focused on building a future. They had a daughter in 1952 and named her Rachel. Hannah worked as a school teacher in Tel Aviv for 30 years, teaching mathematics with a quiet firmness, strict but fair, remembered by her students as the teacher who never shouted and never accepted excuses. She never forgot the soldier who cut the chains. She never knew his name or whether he survived, but she kept that moment as proof that even in the darkest place, someone could choose to be different. In 1978, during an interview for a Holocaust testimony archive organized by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she mentioned the episode. When the interviewer, a 28-year-old historian, asked if she remembered the soldier's name, she said no, that she had never known it, but that the gesture had reminded her of something essential, that even in the worst place in the world, someone could choose to be human. And if he could choose, so could she. The interview was recorded on a cassette tape, archived and forgotten for decades in a university basement, until it was rediscovered in 2003 by a researcher studying testimonies from smaller camps. Hannah Weiss died in 1998 at the age of 87, surrounded by her family in a Tel Aviv hospital. According to her daughter Rachel, her last words were, "Tell someone there was a German soldier who cut chains. Someone has to remember him." Miriam Adler also survived. In 1948, she emigrated to Argentina through a refugee program organized by Jewish organizations in Buenos Aires. She was 18 years old and arrived without family, without money, and without the language, only a small suitcase of donated clothes. She spent the rest of her life in Buenos Aires, worked as a seamstress in a textile factory, married in 1953, and had 3 children. She rarely spoke about the war, not because she was unwilling, but because words were insufficient to explain 2 days chained without food or water, or how a German soldier freed her for no apparent reason, or how that act saved her not in body but in mind, by reminding her that she was still human. But when people asked her, at family dinners or survivor gatherings, whether she had lost faith in humanity, she always gave the same answer. Not completely. Once a German soldier freed me from chains. He didn't say much, just 3 words, and that was enough to show that not everything was lost. Miriam died in 2007 at the age of 77 in Buenos Aires. She left precise instructions for her story to be donated to a testimony archive, because she wanted someone to know that there had been a soldier whose name she never learned, and who chose to be different. Eva Kornfeld died in 1953 at the age of 49 in a hospital in Haifa from pulmonary complications caused by years of severe malnutrition and tuberculosis contracted in Waldlager Süd. The doctors did what they could, but her body was too damaged. Before she died, she asked her niece, a 20-year-old woman named Miriam, to come closer. She took her hand and said in a weak but clear voice that if anyone ever asked whether all Germans had been the same, she should say no, that there had been one who chose to see. She didn't know his name or what became of him, but he chose to see them as people when no one else did, and that mattered. Miriam wrote those words down that same night in her diary, kept them for 50 years, and shared them in 2003 with a researcher from the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. Karl Neumann's story never appeared in official books. There are no monuments bearing his name, no streets in Heidelberg that remember him, no commemorative plaques at Waldlager Süd. He was never recognized as righteous among the nations, because no one submitted the required documentation, because no one knew his full name, and because the 5 women he freed were unable to search for him after the war. Because the system kept no record of gestures of compassion, only of atrocities. His act, cutting 5 chains in a Bavarian yard on a February day in 1945, did not change the course of the Second World War. It did not save thousands of lives. It did not stop the Holocaust or hasten the Allied victory. But for 5 Jewish women, in a moment of absolute horror, it was everything. It reminded them that they were still human, that they still mattered, that someone, somewhere, could see them. And that fragile, small, almost invisible memory carried them through the final days of the camp. It gave them a reason to endure, to not give up, to hold on until liberation arrived. Because in a system designed to dehumanize, someone chose to see people. In a place where compassion was treated as weakness, someone decided to be compassionate. And in a world that had forgotten dignity, someone said quietly, without expecting anything in return, without seeking recognition, without calculating consequences, they are not animals. Those 3 words, spoken in the silence of a loading yard in Bavaria, echoed louder than any military order, louder than any propaganda speech, louder than any bureaucratic threat. Because they proved what the system tried to deny. That choice still existed. That even when all the power of the state, all the machinery of terror, and all the pressure of conformity pushed toward dehumanization, an individual could still choose to look differently. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. It wasn't celebrated. But it was possible. And that possibility, small, fragile, almost invisible, was the only thing that truly mattered. Because resistance is not always epic. It doesn't always involve weapons or battles. It doesn't always appear in history books. Sometimes resistance is a 39-year-old man, hands trembling, uniform dirty, kneeling in a frozen yard to cut chains he was never meant to cut. Sometimes it is choosing for a single moment to be human when the system demands that you be a machine. And sometimes that moment is enough to change everything, not for the world, but for 5 people. And maybe in the end, that is the only thing that really matters. If you know someone from your city or your country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. Perhaps the next invisible hero will be yours.